She called the cops on me for launching my own kayak from my own land. 7 a.m., quiet Montana water, coffee steaming in my hand, paddle already in the lake. Then I hear heels on wood, fast, angry. This woman comes storming down from her mansion, pointing at me like I'm committing a felony. "You are not allowed to use this lake," she screams. "HOA rules, community standards." She starts taking pictures with her phone, threatens $500 in fines for every day I use the water, talks about permits and authorizations for my own property. 3 days later, the certified letter arrives, $15,000 in retroactive fines. For touching water I'd paid nearly $500,000 to own. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the last 15 years investigating financial crimes for the federal government, and she had no idea what happens when the wrong person gets pushed like that. Stay with me. Because when I finally reached into my jacket at that packed community meeting, the entire situation flipped. What would you do if your HOA tried to fine you for using your own waterfront? Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this mess. My name's Marcus Payton, and at 48, I thought I had life figured out. After 20 years working financial crimes for the feds in DC, I was ready for something different. My wife, Elena, she's a school principal, and I had been talking about making a change before our twin daughters headed off to college. We found this perfect spot in Pine Ridge, Montana. 2 acres of pure heaven with 200 feet of natural shoreline on the clearest lake you've ever seen. The asking price was $485,000, which would eat up most of our savings, but we figured it was worth it. The girls could visit during breaks, and we'd finally have that peaceful retirement we'd been dreaming about. Pine Ridge Lake has 847 homes scattered around its perimeter. You've got your mix of old-timers in modest cabins that have been in families for generations, and then the newer crowd with their million-dollar glass palaces perched on the hillsides. Every morning, mist would rise off that glass-smooth water while loons called across the lake. The scent of pine needles mixed with wood smoke from neighboring chimneys made the whole place smell like Christmas morning. It was perfect, or so I thought. Enter Brenda Hartwell, 52 years old, platinum blonde bob that probably cost more than most people's car payments, always dressed in designer activewear, even though the closest thing to exercise she did was walking to her mailbox. She lived in this $1,200,000 modern monstrosity that looked like it belonged in Malibu, not Montana. Brenda wasn't just any resident, she was the HOA president. And she'd managed to stack the 9-person board with 6 of her closest friends through what I'd later learn was some pretty sophisticated social manipulation. So there I was on my first Saturday morning as a Pine Ridge resident, launching my kayak from what I thought was my own shoreline. The water was perfect, that mirror calm you only get in early morning before the wind picks up. I'd just pushed off when I heard the crunch of gravel under expensive hiking boots. "Excuse me," Brenda's voice cut through the morning silence like a chainsaw. "Waterfront access requires HOA approval and fee payment." I paddled back to shore, thinking there must be some misunderstanding. "This is my property line," I told her, pointing to the survey markers. "It extends to the water." She held up a clipboard like it was some kind of holy scripture. "Not according to our community covenants. I'm going to need to see your lake access permit." Lake access permit? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For my own property? That's when she started taking pictures of me with her phone, telling me I was looking at $500 in fines for every day I used the lake without proper authorization. $500 a day. I'd been around enough scams in my federal career to smell something rotten, but I kept my cool. "I'll need to see those covenants," I told her. "They're public record," she said with this smug little smile. "You should have done your research before buying." The thing was, I had done my research. I'd read every single page of the HOA documents before closing, and nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it mention anything about lake access fees or permits for waterfront property owners. Something was very, very wrong here. And after 15 years of following money trails and catching people who thought they were too smart to get caught, my investigative instincts were starting to tingle. But I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole was about to go, or that Brenda Hartwell was about to make the biggest mistake of her life by picking a fight with someone who knew exactly how to fight back. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. Elena brought it in from the mailbox with this worried look on her face. You know, that expression wives get when they can sense trouble coming from a mile away. The return address said Pine Ridge Lake Property Owners Association in fancy lettering that probably cost more than it should have. Inside was a bill that made my coffee go cold in my mouth. $15,000 in retroactive fines, calculated at $500 per day, going back to our move-in date 3 weeks earlier. Attached were photocopied covenant documents, board meeting minutes, and property surveys that supposedly justified every penny. "Marcus," Elena said, reading over my shoulder, "how is this legal?" That was the question, wasn't it? The notice gave us 10 days to pay up, or face immediate legal action to recover damages and attorney fees. Real friendly bunch, these people. Now here's where my federal training kicked in. 20 years of analyzing financial documents teaches you to spot inconsistencies faster than most people can spot a typo. And these documents? They had more red flags than a Chinese military parade. First red flag: the covenant amendments had supposedly been passed at an emergency meeting on Christmas Eve 2023. Christmas Eve. What kind of emergency HOA business happens on Christmas Eve? I started making some calls to neighbors, and guess what? Nobody, and I mean nobody, had received advance notice of this meeting. Second red flag: only 4 residents had actually attended this emergency meeting, where they supposedly voted to amend property rights for 800+ homeowners. In Montana, covenant changes affecting property rights require approval from 67% of all homeowners. 4 people out of 847 doesn't even qualify as a rounding error. But here's the kicker, and this is where my investigative background really paid off. The amendments were passed just 3 days after our purchase closed. 3 days. Either this was the most incredible coincidence in HOA history, or somebody had been watching property sales like a hawk, waiting to spring this trap on unsuspecting newcomers. I spent the next week doing what I do best, following the paper trail. I filed formal records requests for all HOA financial documents, something that made Brenda about as happy as a cat in a bathtub. I also started having quiet conversations with neighbors, and the stories I heard would make your blood boil. Dorothy Walsh, 73 years old and one of the original community founders, invited me over for coffee and enlightened me about a few things. Turns out Brenda's family real estate business had handled 6 of the 8 most recent property sales in Pine Ridge. 6 out of 8. And every single new buyer had received similar fine notices within their first month of residence. "She's been doing this for 2 years, Dorothy told me, her hands shaking with anger as she poured coffee, targeting newcomers who don't know any better, hoping they'll just pay up and move on. Dorothy also shared something else interesting. She'd kept copies of the original 1987 covenants that established Pine Ridge as an affordable retirement community with minimal restrictions. The smell of old paper filled her kitchen as she spread out the yellowed documents. These original covenants specifically protected waterfront access rights and limited HOA fees to basic maintenance costs. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Brenda wasn't just power hungry, she was running a systematic scam. The fake emergency meetings, the selective enforcement, the targeting of newcomers who hadn't had time to build relationships with other residents. It was textbook predatory behavior, the kind I'd seen in white-collar crime investigations dozens of times. But here's the thing about con artists. They always get greedy, and greed makes people sloppy. I ran the numbers on Brenda's covenant amendments. Based on Montana state law, she needed approval from at least 564 homeowners to make changes affecting property rights. She had 4 votes out of 564 required. Her amendments weren't just ethically wrong, they were legally invalid. Every single fine notice she'd sent out was based on rules that had never been properly enacted. In legal terms, she was trying to collect money under false pretenses, which, as it happens, is exactly the kind of thing that can land someone in federal prison. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. First, I wanted to see just how far Brenda was willing to push this scam. Because in my experience, when you give criminals enough rope, they usually end up hanging themselves with it. And Brenda Hartwell was about to get a whole lot more rope than she bargained for. Brenda's next move was straight out of the neighborhood dictator playbook. 2 days after I'd filed my records requests, she posted a lengthy message in the community Facebook group titled, "Entitled Newcomers Threatening Our Property Values." She didn't mention me by name. She was too smart for that. But everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The post went on about how certain recent arrivals were refusing to follow established community standards and how their selfish behavior was going to hurt everyone's home values. Classic manipulation tactic, make it seem like following the law was somehow harming the community. But Brenda wasn't done. She started sending violation notices to anyone who'd spoken up in my defense. Dorothy Walsh got cited for having unauthorized decorative elements, meaning the garden gnomes she'd had in her yard for 15 years. Jim Patterson down the road got dinged for parking his work truck in his own driveway instead of behind his house. Mary Gonzalez received a notice about her fence being 2 inches over regulation height. The smell of fear was starting to permeate the community like smoke from a distant fire. People were scared to speak up because they knew they'd be next on Brenda's hit list. Then came the special assessment notice. $2,000 per household for something called a legal defense fund to fight what she termed frivolous challenges to community governance. $2,000 that somehow nobody had voted on, despite HOA rules requiring majority approval for any assessment over $500. That's when Elena had her brilliant idea. "Why don't we invite people over for wine and paperwork?" she suggested. "Make it social, less threatening." So we did. Elena organized what we jokingly called Wine and Wine Night, a gathering where affected residents could bring their violation notices, and we could all look at the bigger picture together. The sound of corkscrews popping and papers rustling filled our living room as 15 households compared notes. What we discovered was chilling. Every single violation notice had been sent to people who'd either questioned Brenda's authority or spoken favorably about my situation. It was retaliation, pure and simple. But more than that, it was a systematic pattern of harassment designed to silence opposition. Dorothy brought something even more interesting, a manila folder full of HOA financial records from the past 3 years. Turns out, she'd been keeping copies of everything as a backup because she didn't trust Brenda's record keeping. Smart woman. I spread the documents across our dining room table and started doing what I do best, following the money. What I found made my stomach turn. Brenda's family had somehow managed to avoid paying $47,000 in legitimate HOA assessments over the past 2 years. $47,000. Meanwhile, she was billing other residents for violations that didn't exist. "How is that legal?" asked Jim Patterson, squinting at the numbers through his reading glasses. That's when I had to explain something called the Montana Homeowner Protection Act. This law requires a majority vote for any assessment over $1,200 per household, and it makes board members personally liable for unauthorized expenditures. What Brenda was doing wasn't just unethical, it was a violation of state law that could result in personal financial responsibility for every illegal dollar collected. But the real kicker was still coming. Dorothy had one more surprise in that folder of hers. Bank statements showing that the Special Assessment Fund had already collected $89,000 from intimidated residents who'd paid up rather than fight. $89,000 that had been deposited into an account with only one authorized signatory, Brenda Hartwell. Under Montana law, HOA funds belong to the community and must be held in accounts requiring multiple board signatures. Single signatory accounts are only allowed for amounts under $5,000 and only with specific board authorization for each transaction. What Brenda had done was textbook embezzlement. The room went dead silent as I explained this. You could hear the vintage wall clock in our kitchen ticking away the seconds as people processed what they were hearing. "So what do we do?" Mary Gonzalez finally asked. "We document everything," I told them, "and we prepare for war." Because here's the thing about financial criminals. They never stop at just one crime. They keep escalating until somebody stops them. And I had a feeling Brenda's next move was going to be bigger and more desperate than anything we'd seen so far. I was right. But even with my years of experience chasing white-collar criminals, I wasn't prepared for just how far she was willing to go to protect her little empire. The war was about to get a whole lot more personal. The next escalation came at 6:30 on a Wednesday morning. I was loading my kayak for what had become my daily ritual of civil disobedience, using my own waterfront without Brenda's permission, when Deputy Jim Morrison pulled into my driveway with his lights flashing. "Marcus Payton?" he asked, stepping out of his cruiser with the weary expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "That's me." "I need you to step away from the water, sir. We've received a complaint of criminal trespassing." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the lake as Deputy Morrison did his job. Elena's sharp intake of breath from our deck cut through the morning air like a blade. I could see neighbors peeking through curtains and blinds, some recording with their phones, others looking away in embarrassment. Brenda stood on her deck with arms crossed, wearing what I can only describe as a smug satisfaction that radiated from her like heat from asphalt. She'd actually done it. She'd had me arrested for using my own property. The charges were impressive in their creativity: criminal trespassing, violation of a court order I'd never seen, and disturbing the peace. Deputy Morrison was professional about it. You could tell he didn't like what he was doing, but the law is the law, and Brenda had filed a formal complaint. "This is harassment," I told him as he guided me toward the patrol car. "That's for the courts to decide, sir," he replied. "I'm just following procedure." What Deputy Morrison didn't know, what nobody knew except Elena, was that while they were arresting me for trespassing, I'd been spending my evenings making phone calls to some very interesting people in Washington, D.C. You see, when you work financial crimes for the federal government for 15 years, you make friends in useful places. And those friends have access to databases that make Google look like a library card catalog. By the time I was released on my own recognizance 4 hours later, I had a complete dossier on Brenda Hartwell that would have impressed a private investigator. Turns out, our HOA president had quite the history. Similar disputes in 2 previous communities in California, both ending with her family making sudden moves right before major investigations concluded. But the real gold mine was what my contacts found in her financial background. 3 bankruptcies over the past 12 years, all dismissed due to what the courts called procedural irregularities. Translation: she was good at hiding assets and gaming the system. Even better, one of my former colleagues in the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had flagged several wire transfers from Pine Ridge-related accounts to a shell company registered in Delaware. Shell companies aren't illegal, but when you're using them to funnel HOA funds to personal accounts, that's when federal prosecutors start paying attention. The criminal charges against me actually turned out to be a gift in disguise. Colorado attorney Helena Morrison, who happened to be Deputy Morrison's older sister, took my case pro bono after hearing about the situation from her brother. Helena specialized in property rights law and had a particular hatred for HOA abuse. "The discovery process is going to be beautiful," Helena told me during our first meeting. "They want to claim you're violating their authority? Fine. Let's subpoena every financial record they have." That's when things really started to get interesting, because Helena's subpoenas were about to uncover something that would change this from a neighborhood dispute into a federal investigation. The court-ordered financial disclosure revealed that Pine Ridge Lake Property Owners Association was carrying $340,000 in undisclosed debt. $340,000. Hidden liabilities including unpaid legal fees, contractor disputes, and insurance lapses going back 18 months. But here's the kicker. That special assessment slush fund that had collected $89,000 from scared residents. It had been used to pay personal legal bills for something called Pine Ridge Community Services, LLC, a company 100% owned by Brenda's husband. Fake contracts for landscaping services that were never provided. Security services that didn't exist. Maintenance agreements for work that was never done. It was a systematic looting operation disguised as community management. The community was facing insolvency within 6 months, and Brenda had been covering it up by creating fake fees and terrorizing residents into paying them. But federal investigators had been watching those wire transfers, and wire fraud across state lines falls under federal jurisdiction, which meant my 15 years of investigating exactly this kind of crime was about to become very, very relevant. The trap had been set, and Brenda Hartwell had walked right into it. She just didn't know it yet. Helena Morrison's legal team didn't mess around. When you subpoena HOA records in a criminal trespassing case, you get everything: bank statements, contracts, board meeting recordings, email correspondence, everything. What they found was a financial disaster wrapped in fraud and tied up with a bow made of pure desperation. The Pine Ridge Lake Property Owners Association was broke. Not just struggling, completely, catastrophically insolvent to the tune of $340,000 in hidden debt. Unpaid legal fees from Brenda's previous lawsuit adventures. Contractor disputes where work had been paid for but never completed. Insurance policies that had lapsed months ago, leaving the entire community exposed to liability. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember that shell company I mentioned, Pine Ridge Community Services, LLC? Turns out it wasn't just taking money from the HOA. It was the centerpiece of an elaborate embezzlement scheme that would have impressed Bernie Madoff. Brenda had systematically transferred HOA reserve funds to this shell company through fake service contracts, landscaping services that existed only on paper, security patrols that never happened, maintenance work that was never performed. Over 18 months, she'd managed to steal nearly $200,000 from community funds. The beauty of her system was its simplicity. She'd create invoices for legitimate-sounding services, get them approved by her hand-picked board members, then transfer the money to accounts controlled by her husband. The actual work would either never be done or would be performed by the cheapest possible contractors, with the difference going straight into their personal accounts. Meanwhile, legitimate contractors were getting muscled into paying 30% administration fees back to the shell company for the privilege of working in Pine Ridge. Refuse to pay the kickback? Your contract gets terminated for quality issues. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking, but the motive was even more revealing. Brenda was facing personal bankruptcy from failed California real estate investments, $85,000 in credit card debt, mortgage payments 4 months behind on that fancy lakefront mansion. She was drowning financially and had decided to use the HOA as her personal life preserver. Her exit strategy was already in motion. Real estate listings showed her Montana property going on the market in 2 weeks, priced for a quick sale. She was planning to liquidate, disappear, and leave 847 families holding the bag for her crimes. But here's where Brenda made her fatal mistake. Those wire transfers across state lines to hide stolen money, that's mail fraud and wire fraud under federal jurisdiction. The same federal jurisdiction where I'd spent 15 years putting people exactly like her behind bars. The evidence was digital, detailed, and absolutely damning. Bank records showing systematic theft, email chains discussing how to hide the missing money, text messages between Brenda and her husband about timing their escape before anyone noticed the missing funds. Every transaction, every transfer, every fake invoice was documented in the kind of detail that federal prosecutors dream about. This wasn't some amateur hour embezzlement scheme. This was organized, premeditated financial fraud on a scale that could put someone away for decades. And the community impact was devastating. 200 families facing potential financial ruin because their HOA reserves had been stolen. Property values about to crater when the fraud became public. Senior citizens on fixed incomes being terrorized into paying illegal fines to cover up massive theft. But Brenda had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed she was dealing with regular people who would be too scared or too broke to fight back effectively. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who'd built a career out of hunting people exactly like her. The power dynamic had completely shifted. This wasn't about HOA disputes or property rights anymore. This was about federal crimes, organized fraud, and the kind of evidence that makes prosecutors salivate. And I was about to remind Brenda Hartwell that some retirement hobbies are more dangerous than others. Dorothy Walsh's living room became our unofficial war room. The walls were covered with faded photographs from Pine Ridge's early days, young families building modest cabins, community barbecues by the lake, the kind of wholesome memories that made Brenda's crimes feel even more personal. We spread out across Dorothy's kitchen table like generals planning D-Day. Financial documents covered every available surface, laptops hummed with activity, and legal pads filled with notes as fast as we could write. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the mustiness of old papers as we organized 15 years of HOA corruption into a case that would make federal prosecutors drool. Helena Morrison had brought her entire legal team, 3 attorneys and 2 paralegals who specialized in financial fraud cases. My job was to apply federal investigation techniques to organize the evidence in a way that would be absolutely bulletproof in court. The beauty of financial crimes, I explained to the group, is that criminals always leave a paper trail. They can't help themselves. Every lie requires 10 more lies to cover it up, and eventually the whole structure collapses under its own weight. Elena took charge of community organizing with the efficiency that made her such a successful school principal. Within 48 hours, she'd activated a phone tree that reached every household in Pine Ridge. Secret meetings in garages and basements allowed us to share information without alerting Brenda's surveillance network. The response was overwhelming. People who'd been too scared to speak up alone suddenly found courage in numbers. Stories poured in about years of harassment, illegal fines, and intimidation tactics. Mary Gonzalez had been threatened with foreclosure for questioning a special assessment. Jim Patterson had been cited for violations that didn't exist in any official documents. But the most shocking discovery came from Dorothy's basement. She'd been keeping backup copies of HOA documents for 30 years, meeting minutes, financial statements, correspondence, everything Brenda thought she'd successfully hidden or destroyed. "I never trusted that woman," Dorothy said, handing me a box full of manila folders. "My late husband always said to keep copies of everything when dealing with people in power." Those documents were pure gold. They showed a clear timeline of Brenda's takeover, from her election as HOA president through the systematic purging of honest board members and the installation of her puppet regime. More importantly, they showed the exact moment when legitimate HOA governance ended and criminal enterprise began. My contacts in the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit were more than happy to provide expert analysis of the HOA books. When federal agents volunteer their expertise for document analysis, you know you've got something special. They confirmed what we already suspected. This was textbook embezzlement with a conspiracy element that could trigger RICO charges. The legal strategy was beautiful in its simplicity. We'd file simultaneous actions in county court, state court, and federal jurisdiction. Civil lawsuits for embezzlement and fraud, criminal referrals to state and federal prosecutors, emergency injunctions to freeze all HOA and shell company assets before Brenda could disappear with whatever money remained. But here's the part that really made this personal for me: the community impact analysis. Elena and Dorothy had documented how Brenda's crimes affected real people. Senior citizens choosing between medication and illegal HOA fines. Young families going into debt to pay fabricated violations. The human cost of financial fraud isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's real people suffering so that criminals can live beyond their means. Within 3 days, our legal defense fund had raised $23,000 from community donations. People who could barely afford their mortgages were contributing whatever they could to fight back against the woman who'd been terrorizing them for years. The preparation phase was like watching a precision military operation. Every piece of evidence cataloged and cross-referenced, every witness statement recorded and verified, every financial transaction traced and documented. Deputy Jim Morrison surprised everyone by quietly offering his assistance once he learned the truth about what was happening. "I knew something felt wrong about that arrest," he admitted. "HOA disputes don't usually involve handcuffs unless there's something bigger going on." Even the local newspaper editor, Jennifer Santos, committed to full investigative coverage once she saw the scope of the fraud. "This is the kind of story that wins journalism awards," she told us. "And more importantly, it's the kind of story that protects communities." But the most satisfying part was watching Brenda's growing desperation. She'd hired a private investigator to follow people attending our meetings. She'd tried bribing contractors to spy on our conversations. She'd even attempted to have Dorothy Walsh's property condemned for safety violations. Every desperate move just created more evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. She was digging her own grave with federal crimes, and I was going to make sure she had plenty of rope to finish the job. Brenda's desperation reached a whole new level when my kayak turned up slashed to ribbons on a Tuesday morning. The sound of hissing air and the sight of yellow foam stuffing scattered across my dock made my blood boil. Security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned that same night. What are the odds? Anonymous letters started appearing in mailboxes throughout Pine Ridge. Legal-sized envelopes with no return address, containing threats about massive lawsuits against anyone supporting what they called frivolous accusations against respected community leadership. The paper smelled like expensive perfume, the kind Brenda wore to HOA meetings. But character assassination was her real specialty. Suddenly, rumors were circulating about my federal employment record, claims that I'd been forced into early retirement due to investigative misconduct, whispers that Elena and I were financially desperate and trying to extort money from the HOA. Pure fiction. But lies travel faster than truth in small communities. The economic warfare escalated when Brenda's real estate connections started threatening property value manipulation. Phone calls to listing agents suggesting that Pine Ridge was becoming unstable due to ongoing legal disputes. The implication was clear: cooperate with her or watch your home equity evaporate. Then the hired muscle showed up. Private security guards started patrolling the community, harassing anyone who'd spoken out against Brenda. These weren't local guys. They were professionals from Denver with expensive suits and attitude problems. Their presence at community events made elderly residents genuinely afraid to leave their homes. Dorothy Walsh became their favorite target. Traitor appeared spray-painted across her garage door in red letters that could be seen from the lake. The smell of fresh paint mixed with Dorothy's tears as we helped her clean it off. 73 years old, and she was being terrorized for standing up to corruption. But Brenda crossed a federal line when she started intercepting mail. Legal documents from Helena Morrison's office went missing. Discovery requests disappeared. Witness statements vanished between courthouse and community. Mail theft is a federal crime, and every missing document was another nail in Brenda's legal coffin. The utility sabotage was the final straw. Power outages that somehow only affected homes of vocal dissidents. Water service disruptions that targeted Dorothy's house 3 times in 1 week. The local utility company confirmed these were deliberate shutoffs, not equipment failures. Meanwhile, Brenda hired the most expensive legal team in Denver. Morrison, Peterson & Associates, the kind of white shoe firm that charges $800 an hour for associates and $1,500 for partners. Their strategy was classic. Bury us in paperwork, file frivolous counter-motions, delay every proceeding until we ran out of money or patience. But here's what Brenda didn't realize. I'd been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of escalation. Remember those federal contacts I mentioned? They'd been conducting their own parallel investigation for 3 weeks. Financial Crimes Unit doesn't mess around when it comes to wire fraud and mail fraud across state lines. They'd already traced the shell company money through 4 different banks and 2 cryptocurrency exchanges. Every threatening letter, every act of vandalism, every attempt at witness intimidation was being documented by professionals who know how to build federal cases. Hidden cameras were recording the security guards. Mail monitoring was tracking the missing documents. Financial surveillance was watching every attempt Brenda made to move assets. The most beautiful part was watching her legal team's reaction as they realized what they'd gotten themselves into. High-priced attorneys don't like federal investigations, especially when their clients have been systematically committing crimes while the lawyers were supposedly providing legal advice. By Thursday of that week, Morrison, Peterson & Associates requested an emergency client conference. By Friday, they'd withdrawn from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with client objectives. In translation, they'd have figured out that Brenda was guilty as hell and they didn't want to be accessories after the fact. But Brenda's biggest mistake was threatening federal witnesses. When she cornered Dorothy outside the grocery store and told her that old ladies who can't mind their own business sometimes have accidents, she triggered automatic federal protection protocols. Witness intimidation in a federal investigation isn't just another crime. It's a fast track to pre-trial detention. The kind of mistake that turns white-collar criminals into flight risks who spend their trial time in federal holding facilities instead of their own beds. Elena found me in my office that Friday night, surrounded by evidence boxes and legal documents, putting together the final pieces of what had become a federal racketeering case. "How much longer?" she asked. "Soon," I told her. "Very soon." Because federal investigations move slowly until they don't. And when they finally move, they move with the kind of force that turns comfortable suburban criminals into very scared defendants. Brenda Hartwell was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Brenda's nuclear option came in the form of an emergency HOA meeting notice, delivered at 5 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. 72 hours to dissolve the Pine Ridge Lake Property Owners Association, liquidate all community assets, and distribute proceeds to pay what she claimed were insurmountable legal debts. The smell of desperation was stronger than pine sap as residents frantically called each other Friday night. Emergency dissolution required a 2/3 majority vote, but Brenda was betting that fear and confusion would carry the day before anyone could mount organized opposition. Her legal justification was brilliant in its audacity. She claimed the community was facing imminent bankruptcy due to frivolous lawsuits and federal harassment. And the only solution, according to her emergency motion, was immediate liquidation of all common areas, recreational facilities, and community infrastructure. Of course, she'd already arranged a buyer for these community assets, a shell company registered in Delaware that traced back to her husband's business partners. They'd acquire 200 acres of prime lakefront property for pennies on the dollar, then develop luxury condos while the original residents lost everything they'd built over 30 years. The timing was no coincidence. Emergency dissolution over a weekend meant most residents wouldn't have time to consult attorneys or organize opposition. Holiday weekend approaching meant people would be distracted by family obligations, and Brenda's hand-picked board members could ram through the vote before anyone understood the full implications. But she'd made a fatal miscalculation. She thought she was dealing with disorganized residents who could be stampeded into panic decisions. She had no idea that federal investigators had been monitoring her communications and were ready for exactly this kind of desperate gambit. Helena Morrison filed emergency injunctions in federal court before Brenda's legal notice had even finished circulating. Asset freezes, restraining orders, and preliminary findings of federal jurisdiction that stopped the dissolution process cold. You can't liquidate community property while it's evidence in a federal criminal investigation. The media explosion was spectacular. Jennifer Santos published her expose on the front page of the county newspaper with the headline, "Federal Investigation Uncovers Massive HOA Fraud." Regional television picked up the story within hours. Social media hashtags, Pine Ridge Scam, and House HOA Fraud started trending across Montana and surrounding states. State legislators immediately announced plans for emergency HOA oversight reform. The county commissioner threatened criminal charges for public corruption. The state attorney general opened a formal investigation into HOA governance statewide. But the federal response was what really made Brenda panic. U.S. Marshals executed asset seizure warrants on all accounts connected to Pine Ridge Community Services, LLC. Bank accounts frozen, property liens filed, cryptocurrency wallets seized. Every dollar she'd stolen was locked down tighter than Fort Knox. The community response was overwhelming. 400 residents packed the emergency meeting despite Brenda's attempts to intimidate them. Even her former supporters publicly demanded answers about the missing money and fraudulent documents. Brenda arrived flanked by a new attorney, a solo practitioner from Billings who specialized in criminal defense, not civil disputes. The change in legal representation told everyone exactly what kind of trouble she was facing. Her public breakdown was painful to watch. Emotional outbursts about misunderstandings and accounting errors that fooled nobody. Increasingly shrill claims that federal investigators were persecuting her for minor paperwork mistakes. The desperation of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. When residents demanded to see the missing money, Brenda's attorney actually tried to invoke Fifth Amendment protections against self-incrimination. At an HOA meeting, you can't make this stuff up. The final nail came when Dorothy Walsh took the microphone and calmly read from the original 1987 Pine Ridge Covenants, the ones that established the community as an affordable retirement haven with minimal restrictions and transparent governance. 30 years of community history, destroyed by one person's greed and entitlement. Even her husband abandoned ship. Court filings showed he'd filed for emergency divorce and was cooperating with federal investigators to avoid prosecution as an accessory. When your own spouse starts providing evidence against you, the game is over. But Brenda still had one last card to play, or so she thought. She stood up at the end of the meeting and pointed directly at me with a shaking finger. "You people don't understand what you're dealing with," she screamed. "Marcus Payton is just a washed-up federal nobody trying to feel important. He has no authority here." The room went dead silent. 400 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when I stood up, reached into my jacket pocket, and pulled out the leather credential case I'd carried for 15 years in Washington, D.C. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The Pine Ridge Community Center had never seen anything like it. 400 residents packed into every available seat, with overflow crowds standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot. County officials occupied the front row. Local media had set up cameras along the sides, and you could cut the tension with a knife. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her criminal defense attorney, trying to maintain some semblance of authority while fielding question after question about missing money and fraudulent documents. Her designer composure was cracking like ice on a warm day. I'd been waiting my turn at the microphone for 20 minutes, methodically reviewing my notes while residents testified about the financial hardship caused by illegal fees and fabricated violations. Elena squeezed my hand as Mary Gonzalez finished describing how she'd almost lost her home to pay Brenda's fraudulent assessments. When my name was finally called, I walked to the microphone with the same calm confidence I'd used in federal courtrooms for 15 years. The room quieted to that special kind of silence that happens when everyone knows something important is about to happen. "My name is Marcus Payton," I began, my voice carrying easily across the packed room. "For the past 3 months, I've been documenting what I believe to be a systematic pattern of embezzlement, fraud, and witness intimidation involving our HOA leadership." I laid out the evidence methodically. The fake emergency meetings, the invalid covenant amendments, the shell company money laundering, the missing community funds. Visual aids showed wire transfers, forged documents, and bank records that painted a picture of organized criminal enterprise. The audience was riveting. You could hear cell phone cameras clicking as residents recorded evidence they'd never seen before. County officials were taking notes furiously. Even the media looked impressed by the scope and organization of the fraud. But Brenda wasn't going down quietly. "This is harassment," she interrupted, standing up so abruptly her chair toppled backward. "Character assassination from someone with no standing in this community." Her voice was getting higher and more shrill with each word. "Marcus Payton is just a washed-up federal nobody trying to feel important. He probably couldn't hack it in real law enforcement." The personal attack hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Several residents gasped audibly. Elena tensed beside me, ready to stand up in my defense, but I just smiled. "You know what, Brenda?" I said, reaching into my jacket pocket with deliberate precision. "You're absolutely right about one thing. I am just a federal nobody." My fingers found the familiar leather of the credential case I'd carried for 15 years. The room held its collective breath as I flipped it open with a practiced motion. The gold badge caught the overhead fluorescent lights like a mirror, reflecting tiny suns across the packed room. "Special Agent Marcus Payton, Financial Crimes Division, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in the parking lot. Brenda's face went from flushed anger to bone white in the span of a heartbeat. She stumbled backward as if she'd been physically struck, groping for her overturned chair like a drowning person reaching for a life preserver. 15 years investigating wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering, I continued, my voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "And I have to tell you, Brenda, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of financial fraud I've ever encountered." The community's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Gasps, murmurs, and then spontaneous applause that built to a thunderous roar. People were standing, clapping, some wiping away tears of relief and vindication. Brenda's attorney was whispering frantically in her ear, probably explaining exactly how much trouble she was in now that federal jurisdiction was confirmed. His face had gone almost as pale as his client's. "A federal investigation has been ongoing for 3 weeks, I announced over the applause. "Wire fraud and mail fraud charges are being prepared by the U.S. Attorney's Office. All stolen community funds will be recovered and returned to the rightful owners." Camera flashes were going off like fireworks. Local news crews were capturing every moment of what would become the lead story on every channel in Montana. National media was already calling. This kind of HOA fraud story with a federal agent twist was pure cable news gold. But the most satisfying moment was watching Brenda realize that her comfortable suburban crime spree was over. The badge meant federal prison, asset forfeiture, and complete financial ruin. Everything she'd stolen to maintain her lifestyle would be seized and returned to the community she'd terrorized. "Any questions?" I asked the room. The standing ovation lasted 10 full minutes. 48 hours later, federal agents arrested Brenda Hartwell as she tried to board a flight to Costa Rica at Denver International Airport. The sight of her in handcuffs on the evening news was the most satisfying thing I'd seen since my daughters graduated high school. The federal charges were impressive: wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and witness intimidation. 18 counts carrying a maximum sentence of over 200 years. Her plea bargain got that down to 4 years in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, and a lifetime ban from any HOA leadership position. Asset recovery was swift and complete. The federal government seized her lakefront mansion, liquidated her shell company, and recovered every penny of the stolen community funds. $340,000 plus $180,000 in penalties flowed back into Pine Ridge coffers within 6 months. The community transformation was remarkable. Dorothy Walsh was unanimously elected as President Emeritus of a completely restructured HOA board. New bylaws required 75% approval for any fee increases and moved all financial records to a public online database. No more secret meetings, no more hidden accounts, no more opportunities for another Brenda Hartwell. Elena's stress-related health issues, the headaches and sleepless nights that had worried me more than any HOA dispute, disappeared completely once the threat was eliminated. Our property values increased 12% after the scandal resolution, ironically making us money on Brenda's criminal behavior. The scholarship fund was Elena's idea. "What should we do with the penalty money?" she asked over coffee one morning, watching loons glide across the perfectly calm lake. "Something that helps kids," I said immediately. The Pine Ridge Student Achievement Fund now provides college scholarships to local high school graduates, funded entirely by the proceeds from Brenda's criminal penalties. 15 students received assistance this year alone. The Environmental Protection Initiative followed naturally. Community members voted overwhelmingly to preserve 200 acres of lakefront property as a conservation easement, ensuring that future development couldn't destroy the natural beauty that drew us all here in the first place. Dorothy's Senior Support Program provides home maintenance assistance for elderly residents, the kind of practical community service that Brenda's fake fees were supposedly funding. Real volunteers doing real work for neighbors who need help, not shell company invoices for services that never existed. The annual Pine Ridge Unity Days Festival celebrates community solidarity forged through adversity. Local bands, food trucks, kids' activities, and a boat parade that draws families from across the county. The opposite of everything Brenda represented: inclusive, transparent, and genuinely focused on community welfare. Montana's Homeowner Protection Act passed unanimously 6 months later, requiring financial transparency and accountability for all HOA operations statewide. Our case became the legislative model for protecting homeowners from predatory board members. The media attention was overwhelming but positive. 60 Minutes featured our story as part of a national investigation into HOA abuse. Congressional hearings examined federal oversight of community associations. Legal precedents established by our case are being cited in fraud prosecutions from Arizona to Florida. But the most important change was personal. My retirement transition was finally complete, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of fishing and reading novels, I'd found a new purpose: helping communities fight corruption and abuse of power. The phone calls started immediately after the 60 Minutes segment aired. Communities in Arizona, Colorado, Texas, all facing similar HOA fraud schemes. Elena and I looked at each other over breakfast as the messages piled up. "You know what?" she said, refilling my coffee cup with that smile that first caught my attention 25 years ago. "Maybe retirement doesn't have to mean stopping work. Maybe it means choosing work that actually matters." Now drop a comment about your worst HOA nightmare. Let's help each other identify the warning signs of corruption before it gets out of hand. And if this story reminded you why community accountability matters, hit that subscribe button for more tales of ordinary people defeating corrupt systems. Because here's what I learned during those intense months fighting for our community. When good people organize around truth and justice, they're unstoppable. Corruption thrives in darkness and isolation, but it can't survive transparency and solidarity. Pine Ridge Lake is peaceful again. Loons call across crystal clear water. Children play on community beaches. Neighbors help neighbors instead of terrorizing them. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.